Jennifer Jenkins, in her book, cites three kinds of colonizations. One was the one which we witnessed, or the world witnessed, in Australia, Canada, and America, where the colonizers replaced the indigenous population. The second type of colonization was where the pre-colonial population was not replaced but was brought under subjugation, and a part of the population was even allowed to learn English as a second language in case of English, and in case of other European languages, for example French or Dutch, the population was allowed to learn the second language, which was the language of their colonizers. The third kind of colonization was in a way very unique. It involved the colonization of a land, but in this kind of colonization, the indigenous population was replaced by a labor force. This labor force was brought from Africa in the form of slaves. So a large number of slaves were captured from Africa, sometimes from their homes or while they were traveling. So it was not a willing subjugation of people into slavery, but these people were captured from their homes and were then sold off to slave traders. This whole phenomena is often referred to as New World slavery. These slaves were then made to march to the coast, where sometimes they would board ships immediately, and sometimes they were kept in stock and they waited until new ships arrived. It was made sure that the slaves who were imprisoned together spoke different languages. So they made sure that they came from different language backgrounds to prevent rebellion against their masters. Later on, these slaves were then transported to Caribbean islands, where they worked on different plantations, tobacco, tea, etc. When these slaves worked side by side, we've already said that they made sure, the colonizers made sure that people who worked together or who worked in close proximity to each other were drawn from different language backgrounds. So they could not understand or they could not speak to each other because they were all from Africa, they were from different linguistic backgrounds. But these people, because of course they worked from day to night and they had to live their lives, they needed to communicate not only with their masters but also to each other. So there were two kinds of communications which were needed. One was vertical between the slaves and the masters, and the other was horizontal, which was between different slaves. So they had this desperate need to communicate with each other. These people had no other choice but to make an effort to simplify whatever linguistic resources they had at their disposal, and then use that language to communicate with each other. So the process of pidginization involved the simplification of a language used by different groups of people who had no common language and communicate with each other in a restricted way. So we can say process of pidginization involves a situation where there's contact between speakers of 3 or more languages. Out of these 3 languages, one is the dominant language. We call it a dominant language because it is the language of the group of speakers who are dominant, and the other groups, 2 or more groups, are of the speakers who are considered inferior, and therefore the language is also considered inferior. So these other languages, one is the dominant language of the imperial powers or the masters, and the other 2 languages, which were often African or Asian languages, were inferior and were also mutually unintelligible. So pigeonization involved three languages, out of which one was dominant and the other two were inferior to the dominant language. When we have a contract situation where one language is dominant over other languages, the inferior languages play a critical role in the development of a simplified language system. This is exactly what happened in case of English pidgins. The English pigeons that developed on these Caribbean plantations and in some parts of Asia had features of language from the dominant language and also from the inferior language. So mostly the vocabulary came from the dominant language and grammatical structures were of the inferior languages.